I'll want to hear some responses here today. All right? What's this called? It's a point. It is just a placeholder. It tells me and helps me mark where specifically something is in the diagram. So what was this called again? Point. All right. Next one. That's not a line. Line go on forever, right? What was it? Segment. So just segment. So a segment has a start and an end point. So it goes from A to B and stops. We have lengths that we can measure in a segment and start and end point. So this is segment. All right. This one's not line either. It's something different. Goes on only in one single direction. It starts with an R. That's a ray. A ray starts at a single point and then extends out forever in a direction. Starts at one point, goes forever in one direction. So far we have point, segment. This was a ray, and now that's a line, right? Go on forever in both directions. So that's, if we have going on forever in both directions, we have a line. If we have a two-dimensional surface, like this board, if it extended out forever in all directions, what is that called? What was it? A plane. Plane will extend forever in all directions. So if you think about putting a line on, when you put a line on a graph, that XY graph, that graph technically could go on forever to cover the line going on forever. So that XY graph that goes on forever in all those directions, that is a plane. In fact, its technical term is the Cartesian plane. So going on forever in all directions. All right. Next. That's midpoint. Midpoint exactly in the middle splits the segment into two equal pieces. That is a midpoint. All right, but our focus has been on angles, so we're going to be starting to talk about angles. What's that point called? This one's a tougher one. Starts with a V. What was it? It is a vertex. Vertex is the point that the angle starts from and is formed out from. So another way to think about it is that, or another place you might see it is if we have some shape, let's say a triangle, and these points here on the triangle that you might think of as the corners of them, each point there is a vertex of that triangle. So we say that this triangle has 3 vertices on it. And if we made the angles, if we talked about the angles in the triangle, these points would be, each point of this would be the vertex of those angles in the triangle. So this point was called the, say it again? Vertex. And then what was this point? Midpoint. Okay, moving on. Angle less than 90. Acute. And remember my memory trick for you was that acute is a cute little angle, so it's small. Right angled, just right at 90 degrees. Okay, we use that little box to mark the right angles. So our different types of angles that we have are acute, right angle, and then obtuse, big angle, greater than 90 degrees. So those are our 3 different types of angles we can look at there. What's our word for when two things measure the same? Mm-mm. We also use this symbol for it. It starts with a C. Congruent. There it is. This is an important one. So if two things are congruent, that means that their measurement is the same. So anytime you see this symbol written out somewhere, then that should go in your mind as congruent. Anytime you see another place you'll see congruent is in a diagram. So if we want to mark two segments being the same or being congruent, then we mark little tick marks like this on the segments. So if you see those tick marks, that means that they measure the same. If you see the tick marks here on the angles, these blue little markings inside the angle, that also means that they measure the same, which means they are what again? Congruent. Congruent. So two angles or segments or anything that measure the same is going to be congruent. It is a bisector. Bisector, prefix bi means two, so it cuts the angle in two equal pieces. So the reason I put this right by this one, which is congruent, what is it again? Congruent is that we can make segments congruent and split the segment into congruent pieces with a midpoint, and then I could split the angle into two equal pieces with a bisector. So if I want congruent angles, I would use a bisector. Next. Now we're getting into the stuff we talked about this week. 45 here and 45 here. If I add them together, that makes 90. Or I could have, here's these two angles, I put them together and I make 90. So two angles that add to 90, what's it called? It comes, so part of the memory trick for this was that C comes in the alphabet first alphabetically, and 90 is going to come first. So complementary is what goes with 90. So complementary angles are two angles. The measurements add to 90. That is complementary. So two angles adding to 90 is complementary. What is it again? Complementary. And that's versus adding to 180 degrees, which is, say it again? Supplementary. Supplementary angles are adding to 180. So one more time, we have adding to 90, which is complementary, and we have adding to 180, which is supplementary. All right, going on. Two angles being right next to each other. We had said it earlier for a different one. Starts with an A. Now it's adjacent. And adjacent, the word means right next to. So two people that are adjacent to each other are right next to each other. Two angles that are adjacent are right next to each other. They share a common side. They are touching, however you want to think about it. But two angles that are right next to each other are adjacent angles. Then, next one are the angles right across from each other. What are those called? Vertical angles. Vertical angles. So these angles directly across from each other. So I color-coded them. 1 and 2 right across from each other. Those are vertical angles. 3 and 4 right across from each other. Those are vertical angles. And what we talked about on Tuesday is that these vertical angles are the same measurement, which is congruent. What is it again? Congruent. All right, so to recap these last couple, we had the angles right next to each other. Adjacent. We have Vertical angles right across from each other. And then I got one more. These two angles make a straight line. So think line. This is not a tricky one to remember what it does once you know the words. Linear pair. Because it does exactly what it advertises. Linear pair is going to be a pair of angles, and they're going to make a line. Pair of angles that make a line. Linear pair. So angles 1 and 2, if I were to put the angles together, then they would form the straight line. So that's why we call them, what again? Linear pair. So that is our linear pair. So let's just go through the ones that we did from this week. So we had the ones adding to 90, which was adding to 90. So C comes first, so complementary. Complementary is adding to 90. And then adding 180. Supplementary. And jumping ahead, 180 degrees is a straight line. So these two that make a straight line, which is linear pair, is going to be supplementary. Vertical angles. Vertical angles. And we said those vertical angles were congruent. Adjacent angles. Angles right next to each other. All right? So any questions on any of those? Okay. Let's go through them again. And if you want to study these and look at them more, if you go onto the modules on Canvas, I have a Quizlet linked with flashcards so that you can drill these and study them yourself to go through these. So we're going to go through them. So we're going to go through them all again, and then I'm going to mix them up. I'm going to shuffle them and see if you can still get them. So here we go. From the top. As a point, segment starts at one point, ends in another. That's a ray, right? Going forever in one direction, and then going down in both directions. That's a line. What is it again? Line. You say it, you'll remember it better. Plane. Midpoint. Point exactly in the middle of the segment. Vertex. Good. That one's a tricky one. Less than 90. Acute. Little angle. Right angle. Obtuse. It's bigger than 90. Congruent. Anytime you see these symbol or these markings in a diagram, you should jump to congruent. Bisector. Splits in two pieces. Bisector. Complementary. Remember, C comes first in the alphabet, so complementary is first, is 90. There's supplementary. Adjacent, good. Vertical angles, right across from each other. Linear pair. Pair of angles, make a line. All right. Time to shuffle. Go again. Acute. Acute little angle. Linear pair. Pair of angles make a line. Congruent. That's a line. Adjacent. The angles are touching. They're right next to each other. That's a plane. Midpoint. Supplementary is 180. Vertex is the point the angle comes from. Point. That's a right angle. Ray goes in one direction. Segment, start and end point, we can measure its length. Bisector, split in two pieces. Complementary, that's 90. Obtuse, thank you. Vertical angles right across from each other. That's it. Okay. So,